Hi, I'm Mina Malik Hussain and you're watching The Coffee Table, and today I'm very excited because it's a complete nerd out situation. As you know, I'm an extremely big literature nerd, and today we're going to be talking about the Dastan, and I'm really excited because now, if you will, this is my thesis for this show, that we are going to see whether we can draw a link or not, and even if we can't, it's going to be a really interesting conversation regardless. So what I want to talk about today with my two amazing guests is the history of the Dastan and how the Dastan, as I'm sure, well, you will find out later in the show, I'm not going to give it all away, how the Dastan, historically, what the Dastan has meant to this region, and how, if at all, has it evolved over time, and now what is sort of the different shapes and different faces that the Dastan takes now in a sort of more modern situation. And I want to see if we can sort of examine that trajectory, if it exists at all. Like, it's fine. In the spirit of academic inquiry, one can be wrong also, but have a lot of fun learning along the way. I'm delighted today to be welcoming back onto the show Dr. Mariam, who is an assistant professor in literatures and English at the Lahore School of Economics, and also just happens to have written her PhD on the one-volume Dastan of Amir Hamza at Sussex University. And joining us via Skype from Dubai is Ahmad Mian, who is the co-founder, along with his wife Valia, of Dastangoi, which is an online platform centered around showcasing Pakistani history and culture. Hello, and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Mina.
It's lovely to have both of you here.
Thank you.
I'm very excited. I'm really excited for this thesis statement, the thesis of the show. So if we sort of start from the very beginning, Mariam, I know that it's difficult to define the Dastan, but let's try. So what is the Dastan?
If I were to explain the Dastan in one word, it will be story.
Yeah.
That's the usual way that we define Dastan is how we talk about it, a long, never-ending story.
Yes.
And that's essentially how you can define it for a layman. But in art and literature and theory, it's we haven't come to a definition, even now, after so many years. So it's really been only a sustained attempt at storytelling.
That's really interesting. So why is it difficult to pin it down?
I think because the tradition of critical inquiry into the Dastan never really took place. So starting from the 7th century, when the first stories started in the name of Amir Hamza, they came down from the Arabian Peninsula to Persia and then to the Indian subcontinent. The magnum opus then of the Mughal miniature painting in Akbar's atelier was 1,400 miniature paintings related to Amir Hamza and his stories, out of which only 126 survive.
Wow.
So that's the first written and visual document of the Dastan.
Right.
Later, there was a sustained attempt at storytelling, and only in the later half of the 19th century do we have the first written accounts, really, of the Dastan in India and Pakistan.
Okay, so the Dastan, and when we say Dastan for the purposes of the show, I feel like I'm really laying out a paper here now. The tenets of my essay is that we're talking about the Dastan Amir Hamza.
Yes.
So are there other Dastans, or this is just the
major big one? This is the major big one. This is the only, I don't want to say it in so many words, but perhaps the only true long Dastan. So 46,000 pages, 46 volumes in its longest form.
Yeah. Okay. So when we say Dastan, we're basically talking about the Dastan of Amir Hamza for the purposes of this show. I mean, the nerd in me is just sort of jumping for joy right now. I'm like, yes, I'm laying out my thesis statement. Hi, Ahmad, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly. How's
amazing.
It going?
How are you? Like, over the internet, echoes.
I'm great, sitting very comfortably in an air-conditioned office in my home in Dubai.
You know, the joys of the internet, really. So, Ahmad, tell me more about...
It really shows, right?
Yeah. So, Ahmad, tell me more about Dastangoi as a platform. Now, you wear many hats, and now being a sort of a cultural champion is now one of them. So tell me about Dastangoi. So what led you and Valia to sort of come up with an idea that you wanted to set up a platform which is specifically like this?
So to be honest, one thing about Amir Hamza and what you were saying about Mariam was actually interesting, because I think that was the first Urdu dastan that kind of went on, and that was the longest one. So it's fascinating the beginnings of dastani to begin with. Dastangoi came about in a way of just curiosity, to be honest. We were me and Walia just got married in March of this year. We wanted to get married in Pakistan, and we happened to be in Islamabad in our house. And a couple of months into this, I was working on Caravan, and me and her started to realize that we don't know much about Pakistan. Growing up, we used to come back every summer, but having been born and raised over here and in a Pakistani household, there wasn't a lot of historical reference. Like I never took Islam, or any kind of like Urdu history or Pakistani history. And every single time we turn on the TV, it would be like conversations around politics or something like that. And so we're just like, how can we kind of build a platform in this day and age where, I mean, I love going out, Walia loves going out and meeting people and hearing stories. We've done this since we were kids from our parents. How can we create a platform in this age of COVID that is engaging, that comes online and rethinks the whole idea of coming together and telling stories, right? Because coming together and telling stories has been coming on, just like Mariam was saying, from Akbar's courts. The only thing that's changed is the medium. And now, just like I'm with you on Zoom, initially the idea for Dastangoi, what me and Walia had considered was doing it in people's homes. The idea of bringing people together who are curious and want to learn a little bit more about Pakistan, about humanizing some different stories, and then create chapters all around the world for diaspora. But what happened was that everyone's locked down and no one can, get out of their houses. So how do you create something that's a little bit different, like rethinks the idea of storytelling, rethinks the platforms that we have currently, like Zoom, and comes and creates a platform. So we started off on Instagram and did our first event 20 days later.
That was fast, 20 days later.
Yeah.
Some might say you eased into it.
We talk about humanizing these stories because two of the stories of the Dastan, I've actually used them to compare them with recent news stories. One of them to do with rape and how rape is looked at in the one-volume Dastan. And the second to do with the violence against women on the one hand, and how the trajectory of the Amir Hamza story hinges on the women. So at one level, you see these powerful women who are coming out to fight battles and, winning them as well. On the other hand, you see rape, child molestation, you see women being killed, and the characters being protected. And
by whom?
By the main characters of the story.
Right, the heroes
sometimes
then
even
do
women.
So regardless of gender, the hero, the champion sort of steps in to do the right thing.
In one story, in fact, the champion, the Amir Hamza says, Adi has done a really horrible thing. He molested a 12-year-old girl who died. And Amir Hamza says that he must be killed. And Meher Nigar intercedes on Adi's behalf and says, don't. It's okay.
Show mercy, basically.
Show mercy. And I see how when we talk about humanizing stories, we can actually look at stories from the Dastan and think of parallels in today's world where a sustained attempt at storytelling can actually help us unravel critical points that are very difficult to engage with when we are talking about the real. So as soon as it goes into the realm of storytelling or the unreal, quote unquote, we kind of get into that zone where debate is and conjecture in another kind of zone. Because one acceptable.
Because one is essentially creating distance between fact and in many ways, you could say that even when we sort of read a story or hear a story or engage in storytelling, we, as an audience, are also willing to suspend belief for a while.
Absolutely.
And to exist willingly in a state of disbelief, where, of course, then, sorcerers can split the sky open and you can whiz about on a dragon and, your zambil can be a bottomless bag of wonders.
Absolutely.
And things can happen.
Things can happen.
In that space. And I think that that's particularly...
This possibility.
The possibility. And Ahmad, do you see that those possibilities kind of emerging from the work that Dastangoi has so far done? Do you feel like it's sort of leading or sort of promising because it's still quite young? Do you feel like it is... Basically, I think what I'm saying is like, how do you feel the response has been thus far to it?
So I think in terms of response from people having attended has been great.
Yeah.
Has been actually very heartwarming in the sense that, that everyone is locked down and this is the first time that they're getting to kind of switch off from everything that's going on in the news and really kind of relate back. A lot of diaspora people relating to Pakistan and then a lot of Indians relating to Pakistan as well and just the humanization of that. Do I think that we go in terms of storytelling and the people that have been on, are they more fantastical and more on fantasy or real world things? I think storytelling can be any form, right? It can be fantasy. You have people who read Harry Potter, and then there's also storybooks that are much more, based on truths.
Yes.
And I think you can't discount one or another. I think both are just as important. Mm-hmm. And then when we do bring people on, the way we kind of go about it is the essence of Dastangoi for us and how we interpret it is to learn as much about Pakistan. And those stories that we want to kind of extrapolate are anywhere from art, architecture, culture, notable Pakistanis, to music, to film. And so we don't want to just stay in the fantasy, although there is fantasy that is involved for sure. Like, for instance, Sarmat Khusat read a story that was from a book from Asad Muhammad Khan, Ali Dujja Ki Pehli Aakhri Kahani, sorry. Mm-hmm. And that is not a true story, but it still has parallels to real truths of identity. Right? And same thing with Hashim Ali from the first iteration, where he was talking about puppetry and the evolution of puppetry and how it's kind of come into the subcontinent and where it's kind of come from. So all of these different stories have a place in the platform that we're creating. Yeah. It's not essentially just fantasy.
Yeah. And I really like how the platform is sort of bringing together so many different ways of telling a story, because a text is not just words, right? A text is visual and a text can be music. And there's so many ways of creating a narrative that sort of Dastangoi is bringing together, because it's a very diverse group of people. Like you said, there's somebody, who's a molecular biologist, but also plays the sitar. You have, fashion designers who are telling stories. You have film directors. So there's so many different ways of being able to kind of address a very particular Pakistani experience of the world and tell different stories through whatever means, you have at hand, in a way.
A lot of people don't get to see this side of Pakistan.
Yes.
Not many people would know that there's a biologist who's segmenting DNA from Punjab's waters and plants and creating musical scores and then playing them on the sitar. Yeah. And the essence of what we're trying to do is bring those to light and kind of showcase a different side.
Yeah. No, I think it's so exciting. We'll make a very quick break at this juncture, but come back to more exciting conversations. Stay with us. Hi, welcome back to the coffee table. I'm nerding out and having an excellent time talking about narratives and storytelling in the Dastan and how can we use it and how can we sort of learn from these different forms of art and reinterpret them for a modern audience, or sort of find new ways of picking up the strands of a Dastan for us. I'm talking to Dr. Mariam Zia and Ahmad Mia from Dastangoi, and Mariam is not from Dastangoi. She is a professor of literature. So, I'm getting my sentences mixed up here.
Which is totally okay and in keeping with how storytelling is.
Yes, I'm going to now use this for every time I sort of muddle things up. I'm like, this is actually just the dastan of my narrative. So, Mariam, the dastan and the way that it was sort of structured is it's very specific to, and I'm using it in a very sort of unsophisticated way, an Eastern way of telling a story. Because it doesn't follow any kind of Western notions of stories, where this is a beginning, a middle, a climax, a resolution, an end. It just it's a beast of its own.
Absolutely.
So does that sort of speak to how, I don't know, creative cultures, if that's the term for it, or the way that maybe we see the world?
Well, it's very interesting that you put that question, because Dastan theorists, if I were going to call theorists of Dastan that, have had a problem defining the Dastan in any sort of critical way.
Yeah.
So we are only really just beginning to look at the sustained attempts at storytelling to have a beginning, middle, and end for the whole Dastan wasn't possible or probable, because that way the bread and butter of the storytellers would be dead and gone, and we were not going to do that. So there is a fine line that is sometimes drawn by some theorists between Kissa and Dastan.
Okay.
So the Kissa can be looked at as a smaller event within the Dastan that can be told in one sitting with a beginning,
almost
middle,
like an
and
anecdote. Or a story within a story.
A story within a story, but complete in itself.
Right.
So it will have at least 3 events associated with it, as Shamsur Rahman Farooqi will say, or it will have a conflict and a resolution as well. But it does not suit the Dastan as a genre. And I deliberately use the word Dastan because there have been Anglophone approximations, like some people, theorists of the Dastan, have called it the romance, to make it speak to an Anglophone audience, which I feel is a disservice to the Dastan, because Dastan has its own poetics. And we cannot, kind of hold it or pin it down to just one thing. We need to develop theoretical models that look at the Dastan as and how it is and has been.
I love how elusive it is. I feel like even now it's kind of, like trickster, hopping along.
Absolutely.
And not really allowing anybody to put it into any kind of little box or sack and say, this is what it is.
No,
I
that's
really like
true.
that.
Absolutely.
I really like
Absolutely. Musharraf Ali Farooqi actually talks about how we only have the text now because the performance part is no longer accessible in the way that it existed. But, with Mahmood Farooqi and Danish Hussain in India and Dastangoi, they're looking at new ways of telling stories that may not belong to Dastan Amir Hamza, but belong to the Dastan as a genre.
As a genre, and I think that performance is where, Ahmad, you can sort of tell us more about this, is because the platform that Dastangoi is, so far, it's all performance-based, yes?
It's storytelling in it could be narration, it could be your own truth that you're telling, or it could be a musical performance, or it could be a dance performance. And we've had different mediums of storytelling, because at the end of the day, all of these, dance is a form of storytelling.
Yes.
Film is a form of storytelling. Yes. Music is a form of storytelling. So what we want to showcase is not the traditional sense and of Amir Hamza and in Akbar's court. What we want to do is really kind of understand how we can look at the medium that we're on. We're online.
Yes.
The circumstance of people, everyone has been stuck. How do we engage them and delight them? Right? Because Dastan, or a story, is that. And we've been hearing them since our parents and our grandparents' generation, and that they would do that to engage us. Yeah. And the only thing that's kind of changed now is the medium and our circumstance.
Quite
and
right.
so we've had, beautiful performances like Amna Mawaz Khan doing Bhatyam.
Yeah.
We've had Sharez playing the sitar for us. We've had the Rabab. We're planning something very cool in the next volume that's going to be on October 11th. So, there's different mediums.
Yeah, I know, absolutely. And I think that in many ways, and because Dastangoi has also happened at a very particular time in a kind of global history, and I think that the lockdown and this pandemic has had its own kind of trauma on our imaginations as well. And I think that in performance and in sort of reviving the idea of storytelling and delight. I think that delight is a really kind of pivotal idea here, where the idea of that entertainment, it is entertaining, of course, but it should kind of spark joy if one were to sort of Marie Kondo it a little bit. And the idea that the arts should be joyful, or something that does kind of ignite that interest and maybe helps us to kind of come to grips with trauma. What do you think of that?
I mean, I agree, right? Like where for us, it's not just joy, it's not just delight, but it's also curiosity. And that's kind of where we started from, which was we're innately curious. And Dastangoi was a very selfish platform where me and Walia wanted to learn more about Pakistan.
Yeah.
Where it's evolved, it's much more different. But the idea of curiosity, the innate curiosity about Pakistan and the narratives around Pakistan and the people, has been there since the beginning and continues to this day, and I think should be a part of what we do forever. So I really think that there are so many different elements which you can speak about when it comes to storytelling, and how it kind of comes on and has an effect on the nature of the way society is today and what's happening and what's reality today.
Absolutely.
But there's a way of escapism, and there's a way of generating curiosity and a different frame of thinking.
Yeah. And I think that escapism is an interesting word here, because narratives also create, and I think that especially when we talk about the Dastan, we see it as a fantasy text, and we see it as unreal or, sort of not fiction. Very bare bones of it. But being able to go into a space that is not meant to be fact-based kind of also frees you. It's also liberating, because,
Absolutely.
You said, the stories that you could derive from the one volume, Dastan, can be applied to a modern or a current context.
Absolutely.
But because they're a story, and I keep talking about trauma because in a way, the story allows you to take a step back from the horror of reality and find a way to understand what's happening.
Yes, it's a negotiation of sorts, and it allows you that distance from the real, despite the fact that the Dastan tries to remain in between spaces of the factual and the fictional. And it was important within the Islamic concept of Dastangoi. And Dastan is usually, if it's defined, then it's defined within a very specific Islamic context.
Right,
also.
because Amir Hamza was the Prophet's uncle. That was the Hamza.
Yes. So what we tried to do was to sustain this storytelling where we invented legends. And the storytellers would always end with this caveat that we are going to let the truth and fiction of the story rest with the inventors of the legend. So they are going to be the ones who will be considered sinful if there's untruth. And we are absolved of all responsibility.
We're just telling the story. We didn't make it up.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that is wonderful, because you lend a kind of gravitas to storytelling, and you allow storytelling to exist in and of itself.
Yes.
In between the sacred and the profane, or in between
the ordinary and the very fantastical.
Absolutely. And the fantastical has things to tell you about the real, because even life and death in some ways is fantastical, isn't it? So you can put anything really in the realm of the fantastic. Just the fact that we're sitting here talking, if we start thinking about it, is absolutely fantastical.
Well, yes, and it being beamed onto screens. I still think on some levels like telephones are magic, because how does this happen?
How does it happen? Telepathy, the uncanny.
No, but I also really like how the Dastan was an ongoing story, a story without end. And every storyteller or Dastangoi who was telling it, nobody, like you said, took responsibility for the original text. Absolutely. Although obviously they must have been adding to the story from their own imaginations.
But they were always adding.
Yeah.
But later on, when we get to the longer volumes of Dastani Amir Hamza, storytellers did want to take,
ownership
of the idea, especially that of the Lisme Hoshruba, because it became very famous, and that is indeed tributed to storytellers,
yes.
Very specific storytellers who were hired by Naval Kishore Press to write those stories. But yes, so initially, when Ghalib Lakhnavi wrote the 1855 version.
Who knows whether he did, but he did.
About 15, 16 years later, Abdullah Bilgarami came along and wrote his version. And when Musharraf Ali Farooqi was going to translate them and he looked at them side by side, they were the exact same text.
What?
Just with an addition of a few poems here and there, a few ornate passages.
Very sneaky.
So that is why the translation that I worked on is actually called the Ghalib Lakhnavi Abdullah Bilgarami version, rather than we've done away with Ghalib Lakhnavi and now it's only Abdullah Bilgarami.
That's very sneaky of him to just kind of append himself onto the original text. I just wrote a poem and now it's mine.
Well, the entire idea of originality is also suspect in this.
We're going to take a very quick break at this moment, but stay with us because I want to talk more about the Dastan and sort of the ongoingness of the story and how can we now be Abdullahs and sort of position ourselves into that tale. Stay with us. Hi, welcome back to the coffee table. We're talking to scholar Dr. Mariam Zia and Ahmad Mia from Dastangoi about the Dastan and the ongoing sort of shape of the tale. Now, where I was basically going with this idea that the Dastan was an ongoing story and people kept adding to it over the times. Did the story change with history? Did it sort of reflect the times that, the Dastangoi was in at the moment? Like, for example, if you were in the middle of some great war, so did the Dastan's sort of narratives or the stories, did they kind of change to accommodate those events?
Well, because the Dastan as a genre does not exist in the present, it has to exist in the past, long forgotten, like an epic. So it has to belong to the absolute past in some ways. So while there was no direct linkage between the present moment and the story, there are anachronistic details like you're talking about the 7th century and you mentioned gunpowder, for instance.
Right.
Those kind of things happen, but they're few and far between. For instance, the story is taking place in the Arabian Peninsula, but you have a very indigenous Indian kind of way somebody's getting dressed, for instance. So those cultural elements did seep in, not so much the historical of the present, not the present.
No, that's interesting. And then you told me in the break, when we were having our own conversations, is that the Dastan, this sort of ongoing nature of it, kind of petered out around 1919-ish?
Well, yes. So
but why is
the
that?
last known Dastangoi died in 1920, Mir Bakir Ali.
Yes.
And before that, obviously, it was a downfall of the Mughal Empire, which was in some ways sustaining it. The War of Independence, colonization, the sense that the Dastan was a cannibalistic mimicry of the novel in some ways, that the novel was the real thing, that the Dastan was childish, cannibalistic. That's the word that is sometimes used to define the Dastan, and that it is of low literary value.
Yes.
So it was, I love to use Marina Warner's phrase for this, which is that the Dastan was held in intellectual and political quarantine.
Quite right. It was seen as just some sort of,
It was seen as something that was supposed to be shut out to reality. It wasn't real. It was a waste of time. And I see why that might have happened, because the households who were bringing in these Dastangos and paying them hefty sums, they had lost a lot of money by that time. The patronage was kind of dwindling. So these Dastangos ended up in coffee shops or in street corners, and the Dastan was becoming more and more profane in some ways.
Or sort of not elite anymore.
Not elite anymore. And in doing that, because men were telling stories to men, there was a lot of scatology, a lot of pornography that was seeping into the Dastan.
It was becoming common in a way.
Even though I see that when the written form that sustained itself from about 1883 to 1919, we do see a sustained effort at some very, very good storytelling. But the oral version of it, I think, told people to kind of not look at it anymore because it was body.
Kind of interesting that it's sad and it's unfortunate that the Dastangos lost that kind of privilege. But in a way, it also kind of opened up the form in an egalitarian way where more people had access to those stories. And like in a way, and I'm sort of now thinking about, for example, Ahmad, what Dastangoi is doing. And the internet itself is an egalitarian space. Like anybody can sign up and be part of this mehfil, this special evening where people are, talking about the arts, and anybody can attend, and it's a story that is accessible to so many more people. So in a way, it's this sort of. Do you think that that's kind of like the direction that the modern Dastan should take?
I mean, it depends on the person. For us, it has always been that we want to be as accessible as possible. Because if you look at storytelling and if you look at film, for instance, the film industry puts a ticket which makes it only a certain people who can afford to go to the cinema are able to go and attend that storytelling form. For us, because our costs are very low and the way we want to kind of go about it is we want to be as accessible to people as possible. Yeah. It's not about you're better than me or I'm better than you. It's about bringing people together and forming community. There's no one in our view from the street corner to the elitist household who does not get entertained or learn something and has curiosity build up because of hearing someone's story. Yeah. Right. So I think storytelling in that form, we would always, and that's the reason that we always kind of have thought that we will keep it free, because it's for people all around the world. These are stories that are there. We want to make sure that everyone has access to them. And that's the core of, I think, of the way we started Dastangoi is, I mean, we want to learn and we want to bring people into our homes and build that community around curiosity.
Yeah. And I think that is so special. It's such a fabulous place to start because everybody is curious and there is a spark somewhere. And I feel like in the lineup that you guys have had so far, there's something for everyone. It's not limited to just one form of narrative or one kind of dastan. But it's just so diverse and interesting. And do you feel like there's an element of oral history also kind of underpinning the various performances?
So the reason for that, the diversification, is because what we found, I mean, from my personal history as well, is we tend to clique. We tend to kind of form our little clique. Like the artists remain with the artists, the architects remain with the architects, the technologists remain with the technologists. And what we wanted to kind of do was bring everyone together, which is why we don't tell profusely as to what is going to be told. And all of the individuals that are going to be storytelling it's a diverse range. So you are again you're coming together with everyone. And then when you look at the chat and the way people are engaging, it's really magical to kind of see the conversation that kind of evolves in that hour and a half to 2 hour period, right? Because everyone's kind of coming together in that sense. Yeah. And for us, that's always been one of the things that we kind of focus on.
No, but sort of coming back to the second half of my question was about oral history. And sort of traditionally, like Mariam was saying, the Dastan didn't necessarily reflect the sort of historical or political atmosphere of the time. But do you feel like the narratives that Dastangoi is highlighting, do you feel like those do? Do you feel like it is a sign of the times that we live in, and let's say the modern Dastan is one that is much more aware of space and place in that sense?
100%. I think, people these days are affected by what's happening around them. They are affected by colonialism. They are affected by nostalgia. If it's someone who's diaspora and is talking about a conversation that is true to them, being born and raised in New York is very different to someone who is born and raised in Pakistan. Quite. So the way that they perceive the story that they're going to tell is maybe different as well. Right. So it's very interesting when you look at the person and again, the curiosity that kind of forms. And we always encourage people to go and start looking at the history of the person that has told the story and why they would have told the story. And the way that they projected the story is always fascinating for me. And in terms of coming back to the narratives that are existing in the country today, I think that does affect it. And you will see that hopefully in the next session that we do. A lot of the stuff that's going to be talked about or that's going to be shown, like for instance, when the Karachi floods were happening, or the Karachi rains, and the flooding was happening because of, not flooding, but the rains. We started the second volume by showing an ode to Karachi. Because we want to showcase what's happening in Pakistan, not kind of segment it and be unaware and distanced from it at all.
Yes.
But we want to showcase that this is the reality, but do it in a way of storytelling. Framing it in that way. And what Mariam said was very interesting, where a lot of the stories were from the past, but storytelling has always had subliminal messaging of what it is that they want to communicate and what it is that they want the person to action after the fact, right? And I think that still exists today.
Quite right. And I think a country like Pakistan, where we are beset by a lot of violence and trauma and challenges, and in spite of our best efforts, we're all kind of chugging along. But storytelling is a way to, and like you said, Ahmad, if you started volume 2 with an image of the rain in Karachi and how the city was flooded, but then at the same time, then you're also, there is music and there is art and there are performances, and these are the things that sustain us and sort of, keep us going. Because of course, there are so many challenges around the world. We have so many challenges. Everybody has them. But the arts and the story and the ability that humans have to narrativize their experience, I think, creates a way where you can kind of also come to terms with reality.
One way that the Dastan was defined by Ghalib Lakhnavi was that it has 4 elements. Razam, Bazam, Tilism, or Ayari.
Now translate.
So, war, courtly assembly, magical enchantment, and trickery. So one of, at least 2 of those, so magical enchantment and trickery, speak of human ingenuity in the face of crisis.
Absolutely.
Whether it is ordained through fate or happens through your prowess, whether intellectual or physical, gives you some agency. And I think that's very important, and that's, it's not present in the 1 volume Dastan, but in the longer version, that agency, the human agency, is present. And in some ways, very, very important to how stories develop.
Very important. And I think that it's also interesting that that sense of agency is coming from a narrative style that, again, is very, very specific to our cultures and the way that we see the world. And feeling like we have that agency, being able to sort of give words to things that we can't necessarily control or even understand all the time. And I think that's where the Dastan will always have a place in our curious imaginations,
Right.
Thank you so much, Mariam. And thank you, Ahmad, for joining me today. This is such a wonderful conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I hope that you guys did too. If you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe. You can find Dastangoi on the Instagram. I was going to say the internet, but it's there on Instagram. You can sign up for their next volume, which is going to be next month in October on the 11th, if I'm not mistaken. And yeah, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time on the coffee table. Bye now.